Great. Well, Chris and Alyssa, thank you very much for agreeing to sit down and discuss what is, I guess, an increasingly important topic in today's world of procurement, sustainable practice. I know that when I first started working with procurement professionals circa 8 years ago, from a staffing standpoint, the emphasis on sustainability was not really anywhere near where it is today, and I think that's in part down to organisations starting to prioritise a lot more. So it'd be great to understand a little bit more about how you see it working, the remit of what you do, how it's done effectively, and ultimately, well, the key outcomes that we hope to achieve from implementing better practice in this area. So, yeah, well, why don't you tell me a little bit about where you are with Thermo Fisher at the moment, and how you're influencing that, I guess.
Sure. So maybe I'll start and then I'll hand over to Alyssa, right? So and maybe the first thing I'll do is just describe Thermo Fisher Scientific as a company. So we're in excess of $40 billion revenue globally. We got over 400 sites in our network today, and that's continuing to grow through acquisition or through build. We have a data infrastructure which is based on ERP with over 180 different instances of ERP systems. So you can name any sort of brand out there, we probably have it in our network. And that comes back to collecting data and sort of thinking about data linked to what we're trying to do. The supply base here is pretty large in size. Okay, so it's 60,000 suppliers. 2,500 roughly makes up about 90% of our sort of spend in some way. So that's probably where we'll target in terms of thinking about scope 3, which we'll get into. In terms of the size of the company, we have 7 different groups that we currently work with. We got another one we're bringing in through an acquisition. We got over 30 plus different divisions that we do deal with, right? So we think about complexity and infrastructure within the company. We got a pretty fragmented sort of, I call it operating model in some ways, because each division is sort of got their own sort of revenue and EBITDA targets and sort of how to run their division. And we sit across that from a procurement sort of sustainability operations to sort of try and actually pull that together, right? So that's context of the company. Now, when you think about the topic of sustainable procurement and where that goes to, we're clearly trying to lay out the whole ESG umbrella in what we're doing. On the environmental side, we are focused on carbon as a company. So scope 1, scope 2 would be a remit that folds in under us, as well as scope 3 and what we do there. We can talk more to that. And when you think about water, waste, and other aspects of environment, that sort of plays in. When we think about the social side, again, on the social side, modern slavery is important, supplier diversity is important, and what we do around that as a topic within procurement is critical as we go forward. And then the governance side is really around, for us, is really around code of conduct and what we expect out of suppliers in some ways linked to code, right? So we do frame that out. Now, the piece on the why on this is driven for me by a couple of things, and Alyssa can add to this in many ways as well. So part of the why for us, and as we think about it, is the customer has an expectation. We're seeing more and more customer expectations coming in about dealing with this topic, which is important, naturally. Investors. So when you think about investors, there's over $60 billion of investment out there for companies. Or is it 60 trillion? That's a good question. But is it a large investment number that companies that are looking at companies of who to invest in, and that this whole investment piece linked to what companies do around ESG is an important part. And then you have the natural, ecos and governments sort of environmental around the world, around the government situation linked to what are you doing in this topic. And then you got a natural underlying sort of audience that are really interested in companies or what they're doing as it relates to especially environmental topic, but also I think the social topic as well. So Alyssa, if there's anything on your side you'd like to add in there.
Yeah, very similar. I've been thinking about it in about 5 pillars, and you hit on at least 3 of them, which is the customer and investor expectation, and also an opportunity for differentiation through good practice. We also think about risk minimization, and that's both business disruption risk. So if you think about things like climate adaptation or appropriate labor protections, those are all risk mitigation levers within your supply chain that you can pull on. And also reputational risk minimization is huge. We clearly need to provide legal compliance, so that's kind of a no-brainer or just a place to start, but it's really about evolving beyond the legal compliance requirements. And then, as Chris mentioned, there's a talent element here. We really want to attract people that are excited to come work for a company that aligns with their value set, and being able to demonstrate through procurement activities that we do this should bring us a great influx of really next gen talent.
Do you find it's an increasing differentiator that as a selling point to Thermo Fisher? What's the kind of feedback been from the talent? Has it been something which has been an important message that the company needs to have a really strong focus on sustainability to be attractive with new people coming through?
I certainly think so. There's a lot of statistics out there, especially for Gen Z hires, ramping millennial hires, that folks really want to bring their value set to work, and they want to be able to demonstrate how their work leads to the mission. And we have a really exciting mission here about enabling our customers to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. And I think from working in procurement, what a better way than to cascade those requirements into our supply chain and make sure that folks that we're working with, we feel we're really helping them to achieve that objective too.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, it's certainly, I think, something that a lot of different industries have seen, and yeah, it's really useful to hear that it's certainly something which has been increasingly adopted by this particular area of life science as well. So. What would you say is covered by a good sustainable procurement program? So like the focus areas within the business, or particular aspects or topics of that?
Yeah, so Chris mentioned kind of these ESG buckets, which is very much the vocabulary of the day for talking about how a business thinks about its non-financial performance. So we structure our supplier code of conduct, that is, to reflect the issues in ESG, and that includes, in the environmental space, certainly greenhouse gas emissions, but also pollution prevention, making sure that we meet hazardous substance restrictions, kind of all the core EHS capabilities. In the S space, certainly supplier diversity comes to the top in how we practice, but also fair labor, worker treatment, making sure that we're partnering with suppliers that can demonstrate all those core components of a company that we would want to work for around anti-discrimination, things like that. And then in the governance space, all the classic ethics, governance topics, also increasingly supply chain transparency comes. I really think of that in the G bucket within governance. So I think in procurement, we're specifically very interested in looking, how do we see down multiple tiers of our supply chain? How do we make sure that from a transparency perspective, we're setting up an infrastructure that allows us to understand ESG risks and minimize those risks and maximize opportunities, but also protect what each company does best. We want to make sure that our suppliers feel confident in working with us, but we get that visibility to make sure we understand what's happening in the lower tiers of our supply chain.
Okay. And how do you measure or monitor suppliers' progress in that respect?
I think this is the meat of what we're working on here, and there's several different levels, right? So there's everything from just awareness and understanding, and we'll talk a lot about, I think later on, about building in these expectations into the normal procurement processes as a really key way to do that. So how are we communicating from the very start of an engagement with Thermo Fisher, our expectations around our supplier code of conduct and what those different topic areas of interest are to us, and our expectations around disclosure, all the way through how do we select suppliers, how do we contract those suppliers. So there's lots of ways to measure, all the way just from, basic KPIs about awareness, how many suppliers are got that code in their contract or have engaged with us on these topics. There's also performance measurements we can do on a given supplier. How are they performing against our code of conduct expectations? So not just awareness, but also performance. And then in the area of emissions, which is a particular interest to us, greenhouse gas emissions, we can actually estimate and move towards measurement of a supplier's greenhouse gas emissions profile and watch that they're lowering that through time, and that they're setting targets within their footprint to lower their emissions in the same way that we're setting targets to lower our emissions through our very broad and diverse physical footprint that Chris mentioned earlier. So many levels of measurement there, from just basic yes, no kind of criteria to better than, worse than criteria, all the way to really quantitative data. And we're going to have to slice our supply chain in different areas to collect different levels of information because of the really big size of our supplier population.
Mm-hmm. No, I was going to ask that actually, because I know that Thermo Fisher is obviously a very, very, very complex business with lots of different business units and moving parts behind that. So I guess implementing sustainable practice across an organization like that is hard enough, but then you've obviously got the external supply base as well to implement those same values across. So, I mean, would you say that there is a lot of difference between, I guess, how you go about doing that internally at Thermo Fisher versus the different suppliers that you work with?
Yes, absolutely different approaches, but I think maybe Chris, you want to speak to the kind of operational footprint piece, and then I'll chime in on suppliers.
Sure. No, we can do that. So we take the let's talk about internal first, right? So when we think about internal, and today, if you think about the areas of environmental internally, carbon, environmental, so carbon scope 1, scope 2, water and waste, right? So we'll focus on more carbon scope 1, scope 2, because that is definitely probably a topic that sort of most companies are trying to address today. As a company, we've committed to science-based targets by 2050, which is net zero. And then 2030, we got a goal as it relates to scope 1, scope 2. Okay, so that's scope 1, and then scope 3 is also part of that sort of net zero commitment by 2050, with a commitment that we're looking at that 90% of our supply base will have actually agreed to science-based targets by 2027. And Alyssa can talk more to that. Now, as we think about internally, we break that down into two buckets, right? So we think about carbon linked to fossil and fossil reduction, and then the other part is also linked to renewables and sort of renewable energy out on the grid. So we got a clear, we've identified a clear roadmap for by 2030 to address both topics, with a view of getting to 2050 linked to net zero. So I think we feel good as a company on the roadmap we've actually built out. Now, there's a heavy investment to do that. It doesn't come for free, so we have to invest to get there. We also are looking at how we change our practices and behaviors internally, right? So we have what we call a PPI process, which is looking at is a continuous improvement business practice. So we clearly are working with the divisions and sites around how we drive PPI to address fossil and fossil reduction within the company. We're also looking at our fleet and our fleet in terms of diesel, petrol, gas. How do you think of that from an electric point of view? So there's clearly a roadmap we're trying to establish around that as we go forward. The practice at the end of the day comes back to metrics, and so every quarter we as a company are assessing our performance from a division. So you think about revenue, EBITDA. We've added an environmental metric in there as well. So every quarter there's a carbon reduction metric that we are monitoring. We also have water and waste, but it's not as a big of a impact to us as a company. We feel good about our water and waste numbers. We are looking at the environmental number. And that's part of the QBRs with our presidents and our group presidents, along with our CEO, that goes on today. So we do have metrics in place linked to that. If I come back to the topic, and then I'll pass over to Alyssa on scope 3. If I come back to the topic of energy around ESG and the topic of talent and attracting talent into the company, I think it's not only about attracting talent, it's also retaining talent and looking at our current ecosystem, because the energy around this topic, when you talk to people, no matter what age profile you are, okay, there's a lot of energy around this. People want to do the right thing and they want to engage in this topic. I've been working a long time, but the energy around this over the last 6, 9, 12 months has been really tremendous internally. Clearly, when we go externally to go and attract people, this is a topic they bring up, right? So they want to come and join a company that's sort of passionate about this. And we are. Our CEO is very passionate, and that sort of cascades down into the organization. As you think about scope 3, and we think about the whole remit of scope 3, and Alyssa is going to be much more proficient on this regarding how we look at scope 3. But if you think about carbon, and you think about the carbon footprint of any company, you got scope 1, scope 2, and you got scope 3. Our carbon footprint is going to say that at least 90% of our carbon ecosystem sits in that scope 3 environment, scope 3 bucket. And that's where we're putting a lot of energy into as relates to suppliers, carriers, and our products. So, I'll hand over to Alyssa, and she can give some more, insights to what we're doing on the scope 3.
It's absolutely correct. Yeah. So if you think about 90% of the emissions happening outside of your physical footprint, and then over half of those happening from the purchased goods and services that we buy to manufacture and to resell, it's a huge undertaking, right, to work with suppliers. And I think if I had to boil it down to what is the key thing we want suppliers to get to quickly, it's that sustainability literacy component. Like Chris mentioned, your CPO should be able to understand this topic and talk about the scopes of emissions. Your CEO should be able to understand this topic and talk about the scopes of emissions. You should understand what your footprint looks like, and you should be moving towards setting goals. And what we see in our supply population is we have a range of that sustainability literacy, everywhere from, fantastic partners that are, really setting the tone and have been working on these issues for a long time. And that in that situation, the conversation is really about how do we partner together? What different goods or services should we be buying from you so that we can really take full advantage of the work that they've done? And then we have folks that, probably don't know yet what the scopes of emissions are, right? And we need to meet them where they are, help them on their journey. Maybe they're working to expand from just having a core EH&S classic EHS team that works on environmental issues, and we really want to up-level them and do some capability building there and make sure that they have access to the resources so that when we say, hey, we'd really like you to set a science-based target in the way that we have, they have access to the tools, to the training, to the understanding. They can make an informed decision. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to understand where suppliers are on that journey so that we can offer the right engagement points for each community. It's frankly probably unfair to say, why don't you have a science-based emissions reduction target if a supplier has never even tried to understand what their emissions are? So a lot of that is just understanding which suppliers are the biggest, our biggest contributors to our scope 3 emissions profile. What kinds of goods and services do they provide? Making sure that our category managers and our procurement managers that work in those categories can really speak this language fluently, because you can imagine we have really large procurement organization across the enterprise here. Chris can probably keep me honest on the number, but certainly in the hundreds of procurement professionals. We need them to all be able to have informed conversations with suppliers about these issues. And then we need to go out and understand where are they, how do we get them to the next level, and then how do we hold them to account so that there's no surprises as we work towards this 2027 target of having our major suppliers set science-based targets. And that's for both the purchase goods community and, as Chris mentioned, also for the transportation carrier community, which is our next kind of biggest area of contribution when it comes to climate. So we have a journey ahead of us for sure, but I hope that, when we work with suppliers in 2-3 years from now, they're looking back and they're saying, yep, this was new and this was difficult for me, but we got the tools that we needed to be successful. We were very clear on what Thermo Fisher's expectations were and what we had to do to meet them. And now we can demonstrate and we can show a roadmap, because that's what we're all doing. This is unprecedented in the way that, Chris talking about 2050 targets for the business, 2030 targets for the business. These are really long-term problems. And what I want to see across our supply population is a continued maturity there, so that in 5 years' time, everybody's clear, everybody's on board, everybody's got their plan to head towards 2050.
And maybe Jim, just to add a couple of things. We're talking about carbon here, right? So the current landscape and sort of the expectations we expect to accelerate, right? So when you think about the evolution of this topic, my personal point of view here is 2050 is too far out. And I think companies and just general the climate will force us to accelerate that. So we keep that in the back of our mind as we're thinking through this topic as a company. I think the other areas that we probably could touch on is if you think about the social side and modern slavery, and you think about supplier diversity in here as well, right? So we got a pretty aggressive supplier diversity program as a company. We got a pretty significant sort of spend today with small business and diverse suppliers, especially in the US, and it's well in excess of $1 billion as a company. And we're looking to actually build that out in the UK and building out into other countries around the world as well. So we do have a program linked to diversity and supplier diversity, and as part of that, when we think about supplier, we're also looking at it from a diverse perspective. I think the other area that we should touch on probably in this space is modern slavery and the importance of that as well. And we do have a program on that, which I know Melissa can touch on as well. And I think it's important to bring that up in the conversation. So maybe Alyssa, if you want to talk about our modern slavery practice and program that we have there as well, it would be good to do.
Sure, and this really comes back to where you identifying the risk in your supply chain so that you're working with the suppliers that are going to have the largest possibility for impact here. So we just talked a lot in climate about how we prioritize certain suppliers to work with that are large in our emissions contribution. And then when we talk about labor rights, we're really talking about where are higher risk geographies that we're doing business. Are there particular commodities that are of higher risk, and how are we understanding the supplier performance there? So we have a few different tools that we use. One, a very high level that looks across broad ESG performance for a company. It really makes them explain their management systems so we can understand if they're aware of the topics that are of interest to them or of relevance to them, and how are they acting, what are their policies, practices, and results related. And then we have a deeper dive program where we ask really specific questions on labor policy, where we think we need to take a closer look. And this comes back again to really wanting to protect, respect, the people that work in our supply chain. So it's a very different supplier community, and the way that we're going to talk to these suppliers about ESG broadly is, hey, we've got a suite of tools, we've got a suite of prioritization methods, we've got a different maturity in each of these areas. You may engage with us on all of these topics. You may engage with us on one of these topics. It really depends, where the prioritization lies and what the company provides for us, where they do business with us, what's our strategic relationship. So that we're trying to take a holistic view of the entire supply chain, but then drill in where it's most practical and most impactful. So not everybody gets every survey, not everybody's going to do every program. We really got to prioritize here so that we're meeting people where they are and they're building out their expectations in line with where we want to go.
So it's far more, well, I guess that obviously there needs to be an element of standardization behind it, but it's tailoring it to making sure that everyone is actually engaged in this and they don't just necessarily think it's arbitrary and doesn't necessarily apply to them. So, for example, if I engage with a company and I'm involved in an RFP process, although I'm a recruiter that works in a niche area, a lot of the time I get an RFP through and there's just whole sections which just don't apply to me and that sort of thing. You're saying you kind of want to avoid that sort of thing in terms of supplier engagement.
Yeah, and I think we're doing it, to be fair, in the RFP process, we do kind of cover a broader swath there to really, one, it's a great place to set expectations for any supplier, just make awareness of, hey, if you want to do business with us, these are the kinds of things that we're asking for. And then if it's a question that's really not applicable, of course, people can, but I think where we're focusing more on that, meeting people in particular programs is in the ongoing supplier relationship. So the relationship management piece of procurement. And that's this ongoing, okay, we're going to work together for a long time. And here's some elemental things we want to see. Here's some places where we've identified either the practice isn't meeting our expectations, so we want to see more, or we think there's an opportunity for partnership, so we want to see more, diving in there. And I guess one thing that you just brought up that I think is also really important is, yes, we may prioritize different supplier populations for different programs, but underlying each of these programs, we are really trying very hard to use common tools, common methodologies, common language, so that when a supplier is working with multiple customers, they are not being asked by Thermo Fisher to do something that is crazy custom or out of the norm. So even our supplier code of conduct is aligned with the pharmaceutical supply chain initiatives principles. We really want to keep that as common as we can. We use a few platforms, Gavadas being one, CDP being another for carbon. We use tools that suppliers are likely to see again so that they don't have this massive administrative burden of custom surveys, custom questionnaires. We really want them to make it easy to explain to us what they're doing so that they can work on the doing, if that makes sense. So yes, who we're choosing on how to engage is intended to be different, but the tools and the platforms that we're using to engage should be the same.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So, are you finding I mean, how does your company embed these practices into the everyday activities of a procurement organization? So obviously we just talked about like the RFX process and things like supplier risk and SRM, but I mean, how do you actually sort of get people to I guess sort of listen and embody what you're doing?
So internally, Chris mentioned we have some KPIs that we're really trying to surface next to the business key performance indicators. So internally, we have QBR structure. People are seeing these things again and again and again. No surprises. On the supply chain side, we have metrics built into our annual goal planning around deployment of these initiatives so that make sure that everybody internally understands where we're trying to go and is aligned with having conversations with their suppliers about that. That's something that we surface back to the procurement leadership team regularly. And then with suppliers, like you said, it's every point along the engagement curve from the first time they're with us in an RFX all the way through to quarterly supplier business reviews. They should be seeing and engaging with us. Contract, another example, we have some standard terms in the contract that we want to see, that again sets that expectation. So all through the procurement lifecycle, we're plugging in. Chris, what would you want to add here?
Yes. So if you think about, let's start with our the procurement function, right? So we do have a couple of things that we are doing there, right? So everybody goes through a annual training when it comes to supplier diversity. So that gets pushed out through Thermo Fisher University. We've run Alyssa and her team have run a number of webinars with the procurement sort of category sourcing teams regarding this topic as well. So we ran 3 webinars, I think, this year so far on the topic of what we're doing on this. Procedures. So right, when you think about procedures and going out in terms of RFPs, RFXs, part of that within the procedure there, we do have, whether it's diversity or modern slavery or whether it's linked to carbon, they'll be built into templates around what we're doing. So we'll standardize as much as we can from a policy procedure point of view. Then from a training and practice point of view, we're sort of embedding that into our processes. We work closely with corporate social responsibility, the CSR team, and CSR within the company is more dealing with the external facing out to our investor relations with our customers, and with our corporate accounts team. So we're as we look at what comes in from our customers in particular, we're taking that into and looking at it about what's the customer requests are linked to their RFPs, right? So when we get RFPs from our customers, we're looking at that. We're also looking at that about how do we have to address their questions going forward, but it also we're looking at that around as we send out our RFPs, because this is a cascade, right? So if our customer is asking for it and it's something that we must get from our supplier, we're going to cascade that down. Okay, so there's a maturing here, Jim, right? So this doesn't happen overnight. I think many companies are trying to think through how to deal and address this particular topic. It's not so much a new topic. This topic's been around a long time in many ways. I think what's happening though is it's getting more heightened. There's more energy around this, clearly, and there's a higher expectation in the world linked to addressing this whole ESG umbrella. So it's something that is maturing, and I think companies are maturing with it. We also need to put it in context of prioritization as we go and address this as we go forward. If we think about the supply base in particular, again, our supply base, we got a supply base that's mature, that understand this topic very well and are doing really good things with this, and we're working with them. And then we have a supply base that doesn't even know where to start. Okay, so we have to figure out how we work through that process with them as we go forward. Okay, so there's a piece that companies like us have to actually work and help and bring suppliers along as well, and that's part of our role, I think, for the company of our size. Okay, so that's something that we have to do as we go forward, working with our supplier and supplier configuration. So, but that maturing piece is still out there. I think every company is trying to figure out what's the gold standard on this.
Yeah. No, you are exactly right. There are so many companies out there at varying levels of maturity around how they do this and how they engage with their supply chain as well. I would certainly say that there are a lot of organisations that perhaps aren't necessarily as involved in some areas like procurement from a strategic standpoint or supply chain management, where this is not necessarily something at the top of their agenda. I mean, what advice would you give to any individuals looking to implement more of a way of thinking around sustainability within procurement or supply chains?
You have to start. I'll be honest about it. It's you have to make the leap of faith, and you have to start. Because it's interesting, and the more you talk to people out there, it's amazing about the number of companies that really haven't thought through how to actually address this topic. And if you don't start, you're going to lose. That's the way I look at it. I think it is a competitive advantage for many companies to get out there and start doing something. If you have the ability, I would say you need to invest, right? And invest means you start creating some thought leadership around this. So you start building out a team around this particular topic. You can't do this sort of part-time in some ways. You need to create a dedicated sort of focus on the topic. And you know, I'm lucky. I'm saying I in this case because I'm lucky within the company, within Thermo Fisher, that this is a topic that's really critical, and I've been able to establish a team. So Alyssa is part of that team that we sort of created, and we're going to make some momentum on it. So we got some catching up to do in some ways. I think Scope 1, Scope 2 on the carbon side, we're ahead. I think supplier diversity, we're in good shape. But there's other areas we're trying to catch up on, and we will catch up, and I think we're starting to do that. But you do have to invest, and it's making that leap of faith. It's not going away.
No, no, it's not indeed. So no, okay, well that's really useful to know. I mean, was there any other topics that the you folks wanted to cover off or thought it'd be valuable to?
But yeah, it's interesting, and again, when you think about this whole area, and maybe Alyssa can touch on that a bit as well, that
sure.
You know, when you think about companies and sort of the news, is really what are you doing around you know, packaging comes up a lot. What are you doing around recycling, the circular economy, as we in some ways that we are doing, you know, as a company, we are doing work in this space, right? I think what we haven't done as a company probably is bring all the good stuff together and actually sort of share what that is. And we're working on that right now. But we have done some really good stuff around, you know, taking styrofoam, what we call a styrofoam container for shipping product, and replacing that with a recyclable packaging format. And we feel pretty good about what we're doing around sort of how do you think about what you're doing today on packaging and shipping, and how do you replace that with a better product for the customer, but also for the environment. And this is another area that, as a procurement function, we're heavily involved in, and I'm sure Alyssa could sort of add to that topic as well.
Yeah, I think it's about that product life cycle and its corresponding packaging as well. But I've been talking to the procurement colleagues really about these three buckets of conversation with suppliers. And you know, one is the who we buy from, and that's a lot of the programs we've been talking today. We want to be in business with people that are also committed to these efforts, setting targets, minimizing their risk, doing the right thing. The how we buy, also spend a lot of time talking about that today. So is this embedded into every procurement conversation? And then lastly, to Chris's point, what we buy. And this is around the innovation arc. So how does procurement partner with R&D to develop products that are going to have a smaller footprint, a circularity option? Are we really utilizing the best materials? And that's a two-way conversation with suppliers, right? So of course, we need R&D to buy in and work with us to spec in the best available. But we also need to be working with suppliers and understand what's coming down the pipe for us, what's the innovation stage, and send signals to the marketplace that we require innovation to meet our objectives when it comes to our product design and deployment. So trying to think holistically about that product life cycle. What are we buying is a big component. How do we design it to be optimized for recyclability, end of life, minimizing energy use during life? We have a big instruments portfolio. So how do we make energy efficient products? But thinking about that through its arc, and then where does procurement plug in and support the other business functions in making that product life cycle minimized? That's going to flow down and impact all of our other climate objectives, right? If we're designing for optimal manufacturing, that helps our scope 1 and 2 emissions. If we're designing for optimal use or for best end of life or better upstream implications, all those things have impacts on these carbon emission buckets.